Hello everyone and welcome to another Arcane Mage video. In this video I'm going to go over some of the Shadowlands class updates and how they might relate to Arcane Mage. We'll begin by talking a little bit about what the kind of basic problems are with Arcane in the current BFA, what we maybe are hoping and looking forward to seeing, and how the changes that Blizzard has posted recently potentially address those things. Okay, so at the moment, Arcane Mage is actually a really fun spec to play for some people, and for other people, it's really a meme spec. Part of that is driven by the problem of having most of the class's damage be associated with a burst window through arcane power. And we've been basically stacking buffs all together, our Rune of Power, World Vein if we're using that, or a Guardian, trinkets, cooldowns, lust, all packing that into a very brief 10-second window and doing dominating damage in PvE, but outside of that having fairly lackluster gameplay. On the PvP side, you'll see a lot of Arcane Mages basically spamming arcane missiles, which has not been the most interesting gameplay. And maybe some people find it fun, but part of the reason it has a meme quality to it is people are not really interested in pressing a single button as part of their rotation, or even having the perception that all they're doing is pressing one single button. On the AoE side, in PvE, I think there's a lot to that Arcane offers, and I think it's closest to what I think Blizzard is hoping to reach for when it reiterates on Arcane. So, the biggest problem I think Arcane currently has is not, in my opinion, that the rotation for PvE or PvP is kind of static, or that you're pressing one button. It's that the payoff for the basic mechanic of Arcane is not fulfilling enough. So Arcane has a really cool mechanic in that its mana management actually matters. Almost every single other DPS class has mana as a utility portion of their kit. So casting your support spells will drain your mana and usually take a large chunk of it away. But for your regular rotation, it has no impact at all. Arcane is not like that. And in fact, for a lot of the historical use of Arcane Mages, mana has been, and its proper usage has been, a significant part of how the class plays. I like this. I like that mana is significant. And in fact, if you look at the talents for Arcane, most of them have something to do with mana management. Arcane Familiar, Rule of Threes, Charged Up, Reverberate, and the entire 100 row. All of these things have something to do with helping us to manage our mana. Now, historically, there have been Arcane iterations where staying above a certain threshold was rewarded. And these, I think, were some of the most fun times for Arcane Mages, because the reward was really commensurate with the effort of staying above that threshold. Currently in BFA and PvE, it's not really significant. We do have talents that help with that, help to, in other words, double down on this flavor, things like Equipoise, but it's not really to the same degree. So Equipoise is really, really awesome and valuable when we're in our burst window, when we're piling all of our CDs together. But outside of that, the amount of damage you do just in your conservation phase, though it's impacted by Equipoise, so staying above 70% is great and helps your damage, it's nowhere near as significant as screwing up your rotation in single target. And in AoE, of course, things are completely different anyways. We're spending our resources by casting barrages, we're building with Arcane Explosion, and in reality, it's a little bit closer to the idea of slowly whittling down your mana and then evocating back up. In any case, I think the biggest changes I'm looking for is some way to either really make the flavor of managing mana significant, or changing this spec altogether so that it's not so dependent on a single button in both of its rotations. Let's head over and check out the first set of changes, the class updates, and then we'll maybe go from there. So, as an opening, We have spells returning for all classes, and that's true for mages in general. We get Fire Blast, Frostbolt, Mirror Images, Fire Ward, Frost Ward, Alter Time, and Focus Magic back for Arcane. I think the most significant of this is Alter Time. Alter Time is an ability that you press after a short amount of time or another pressing of Alter Time. You will return to the same position and the same mana and health. Amazing, largely a PvP talent, but for mages, Arcane Mages especially, there's a significant PvE element to this. I love this idea. Alter Time is excellent in my opinion. The reason for that is it allows a higher ceiling on player skill. If you think about the way Arcane Mages play currently, where you stack a bunch of things together in PvE and you burst things down, and then you evocate back up. What Alter Time allows you to do is extend that burst window. It makes talents like Arcane Power, it makes talents like Time Anomaly and Arcane Orb potentially interesting again, because you can lean on those as being potentially useful if you can basically get a longer burst period. So if 10 seconds is all you have, these things aren't anywhere near as good as overpowered. But if you can alter time to keep yourself above a certain threshold of mana for much longer, maybe they come back into the scene. In any case, the idea of managing your mana and having a payoff for that, this is a good sign that they're heading in that direction with altered time. So the other changes specifically for Arcane is that clear casting now has an additional stack. Mastery Savant, it extends to all arcane spells. Touch of the Magi, which is a talent. In the center row, let me just put it up on the screen for you here. Touch of the Magi gives Arcane Blast a 10% chance to apply this. I'm in my reading of this document, it looks like they're making it something a button you press rather than just a passive effect. So we would press Touch of the Magi or get it passively, and then we have a window within which to burst damage and explode that out to other things. So currently it sits as in a tier that's kind of very bad in general. This 90 row is pretty much awful, but Touch is the go-to single target portion of that. Nether Tempest is the go-to AoE if there's a ton of mobs that are going to live forever, and Reverberate is the standard AoE build just for managing mana. But Touch as a button we can press at a certain time that we can then burst into is interesting. And the final piece is Enlightened, a new talent that rewards mana management. While the Arcane Mage's mana is above a certain threshold, it empowers all arcane damage dealt. And then it returns mana. So it's kind of like Blizzard's moving in two directions. And I think this is interesting. The first is that clear casting is gaining an extra charge. Why is that significant? Well, currently, the game we play of staying above a certain threshold of mana, 70% for Equipoise, is modified by us getting clear casting, which basically allows a free cast of arcane missiles. It essentially allowing us to remain above 70% without spending a bunch of mana for another arcane blast. So every clear cast missiles is another opportunity to press arcane blast in general. That's a little bit vague, but basically it allows us to stay within that window for longer. Giving us 2 charges of it is significant because when we're in our burst window, we often accumulate a charge that is just hanging there waiting to be used, so that when we evocate back up and we're at 100% mana, we don't want to use that charge right away. So we're kind of wasting the charge by having to burst into the 80 to 90 percentile so that we can effectively use it to bridge the gap and get more arcane blasts off. Having 2 charges means we can play this game a little bit better. We can hold that first charge until we get a second, and it gives us more opportunities to be in the exact window we want to be, managing our mana between 170% or whatever it's going to be. But here's the interesting thing. They're extending our mastery to all spells. So currently, it only impacts Arcane Blast damage and Arcane Barrage damage. So Arcane Blast gets increased significantly by mastery. It's a fairly decent stat in single target. Probably not quite as good as crit and versatility at the moment in BFA, but still useful. And Arcane Barrage is okay. Explosion is better because we do more damage with Explosion if we have the right setup for AoE, but giving Barrage a bit of a damage is fine. But extending this to all abilities means that Arcane Missiles itself is suddenly going to be useful, not just as a mana management tool, but really as a significant DPS tool. In addition to that, all of the other utility spells, everything in our kit that we haven't been using for now, all of the talents that we avoid, things like Supernova, which we never touch. Let me just put it on the screen for us. Things like Supernova, which we don't play anymore because it doesn't really do anywhere near enough damage. Things like Nether Tempest, which also just doesn't scale with enough damage. Arcane Orb, which we only really use as a mana management tool and a charge management tool. Doesn't really do enough damage. If we look through our spellbook, Arcane Explosion, gaining damage based on our mastery. Excellent. Good change. Is it going to completely transform how Arcane plays? I.e., will it still be a meme spec? Probably partially, yes. My guess is I don't think they have enough time to completely alter how Arcane plays the game. That is, staying away from this model of managing mana and this model of having burst windows and this model of having a one-button spec. But if they're going to give us back the reward for managing mana well, I think it's something to look forward to. Because currently the reward is very small. So anything moving in that direction I think is a really good thing. It at least satisfies one element of Arcane, and potentially, given that mastery is extended to everything, maybe it creates the opportunity for some really cool builds. Let's take a look at the other portion, which is the signature abilities. So we get Radiant Spark, potentially, with the Kyrians. We have to ally ourselves with this faction. Conjure Radiant Spark that causes arcane damage instantly and additional damage over time. The target takes a percentage of increased damage from your direct damage spells, stacking each time they are struck. This effect ends after a number of spells. So, I don't know exactly how this works, but it's a button we press. It seems to line up well with arcane burst windows. So we would have our cooldowns all together. Maybe we would be at our maximum stacks of arcane charges, and we're blasting within the window at the top of our mana pool. We spark and then go into that and deal a truckload of damage. Additionally, perhaps the percentage of increased damage stacks via missiles. So maybe each of our arcane missiles will proc this and increase the damage. So there might be builds where we want to spark when we have 2 charges of arcane missiles. We press both of those clear casting and then finish off while we're in arcane power with blasts, so that the top end of Radiant Spark is increased by a truckload because each of our missile procs is hitting. Interesting. So this is a way to double down on burst windows. Okay, the mirror conjures mirror to torment the enemy for a time. It's a dot. Whenever the target casts a spell or ability, a mirror is consumed to inflict shadow damage, and their movement and cast speed are slowed. The final mirror will instead inflict shadow damage to the enemy, rooting and silencing them for a time. Okay, so these mirrors This seems very much PvP oriented, or a kind of on-use PvE, set it and forget it. And maybe it has some utility in encounters where we need to silence something, but that doesn't look very reliable, because depending on what the mob is doing, the silence comes after a certain number of casts or actions. Interesting. It will have to, of course, depend on whether the Venthyr mirrors do enough damage to warrant using that over something like Radiant Spark in a PvE scenario. But certainly it offers something on the PvP side that's interesting. Necrolords transform into a powerful mage for a period of time. While in the form of a skeletal mage, your frostbolt, fireball, and blast are greatly enhanced and your spell damage is increased. Okay. So this looks like a cooldown to put together with our other cooldowns. It's just we get to turn into a skelly mage and start firing off things. I think this is, again, if we're talking about mana management being a go in Shadowlands for Arcane, this looks like potentially a go-to ability. Not only is the Radiant Spark one kind of a window of time, and maybe it's not clear how much percentage damage you're going to get off. Deathborn seems to just line up exactly with what Arcane wants to do, which is cast Arcane Blast. And if you get I'm not sure what a greatly enhanced Arcane Blast is, but it sounds fairly potent. Maybe even our fireballs and frostbolts will do amazing things if Mastery Savant is working in our favor. What I mean by that is, say you get a super fireball and you want to stay above a certain mana threshold. So you use your cooldown Arcane Blast to a certain point. You're about to dip below the percentage that's significant, and instead you cast a few fireballs that are also empowered. I don't know what the damage is like, but obviously it seems like, given Arcane's kit, we'll probably just be using this to Arcane Blast. This seems to me to be the one that we would probably go to, given that it's just basically another damage amp, and in Arcane's current kit, damage amps are insane. So look for a bunch of Skelly Blasts coming out in Shadowlands. I think this is probably your go-to single-target PvE faction. Shifting Power. Draw from the ground beneath you for a period of time, dealing nature damage over time to nearby enemies, while channeling your ability cooldowns are reduced. Okay, so this is an interesting take. A few things to think about here. If we have damage windows that require more uses of arcane power, this is potentially good. If we have such significant payoffs for staying above certain mana thresholds, this may also be good. And the reason I say that is any time spent not casting Arcane Blast that is still at the level of casting Arcane Blast, so still producing a lot of damage, is good, because we can weave it into our rotation and stay above the mana threshold that's required. Are these things impacted by the new focus on mastery? In other words, will it be counted as all spells as far as mastery is concerned? I'm not sure. I kind of doubt it, given how Schism worked out for Disc Priests in this latest expansion, but we'll have to see. One of the things that worries me a little bit, especially for specs like Arcane, is having to select one of these factions and finding out later that it was just the incorrect faction for how much damage is produced. So there's very significantly different effects going on here. Mirrors especially, very different. Spark and Deathborn seem to be a similar type of thing, doubling down on burst windows. Shifting Power, again, maybe it's more AoE oriented, but if it ends up being completely busted in that regard, like it takes our Arcane Power CD and makes it essentially a 20-second cooldown whenever we press that. Maybe it's the choice that we just don't know. I'm hoping as the testing goes forward, that it becomes clear either that we should take X faction, or that these things don't really have a significant impact. And that's going to be sad for me, because I think, like a lot of players who either play a lot of specs or who have a niche spec like Arcane that is not really used, and maybe your raid demands that you play the best thing, so you'll have to play fire, that kind of thing. There's the potential for a lot of angst, because you look at this faction and you think, wow, I should have picked this one. Like, for fire mages, Radiant Spark is just hands down better, or Deathborn or something like that. But for Arcane, it's not nowhere near. Or maybe for fire mages, shifting power is really the way to go. But for Arcane, it's just horrible. This has a lot of danger for Arcane, specifically because we tend to have been historically, and we still are today, a burst window class. So within that 10 seconds, so everything that stacks into that, like Deathborn and potentially Radiant Spark, like some of this new, the Touch of the Magi button that we're going to get, all of these things force us into that window and make these kinds of choices difficult. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed that little rundown of Arcane and my thoughts on what we've seen so far. I'll try to keep abreast of how things develop. Maybe if I get access to alpha or beta, I will do my best to post my thoughts about how it looks when we get to test these things out. I'm kind of excited. Look, I know Arcane's a meme spec. Some of you love it. Those of you who come by to see what's going on, I enjoy it too. I think the mana management element is really undersold. It's really cool and awesome. I hope, as we see with these changes coming forward, that they really do commit to this new idea of Enlightened and mana management, that they commit to their Mastery Savant being a significant part of how this spec plays. But we'll see. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. We'll catch you next time.